فكلي واشربي وقري عينا فإما ترين من البشر أحدا فقولي إني نذرت للرحمن صوما.
Hey everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Islamic Mary podcast. So for today, I want to speak about the prophet Jacob or Yaqub. And in the last couple of weeks, I've lost my father. My father passed away. And I've been thinking a lot about fathers. What does a father mean? What is the role of a father? Are they supposed to be a provider, a mentor, a coach, someone that encourages you to do something? And that's made me look more deeply into the Qur'an and the biblical tradition on the role of fathers. What do they do? And as you know, I'm writing my second edition of my book, The Bible and the Qur'an, Biblical Figures in Islamic Tradition, and we have an entry on Jacob. So Jacob and Yaqub appear within the Qur'an, specifically in the chapter of Joseph or Yusuf. And Joseph and his father Jacob, they have this amazing relationship. As we know that Joseph, he goes to his father in the beginning of the chapter and shares with him his dream. And this demonstrates that he had this close relationship with his dad, that he could go to him and share private and intimate thoughts and get his advice on what he should do next. His father tells him not to share the dream with his brothers. Eventually, Yusuf is taken by his brothers and thrown into a well, and then he's separated with his father. Now, despite the mysterious and suspicious circumstances of Yusuf being missing, that Jacob, Yaqub, he still forms this relationship with his sons, that even though he feels something went wrong there when they were taking care of Yusuf, that he feels that he should still be a good father to them and still be a spiritual mentor. So the part of the chapter of the story of Yusuf that I want to focus on is in the later part in verse 83. And this is a part where they have gone back and forth several times to Egypt looking for providence and sustenance, and they actually lose their second brother, Benjamin, to Yusuf, not knowing that Yusuf is actually the person who is the head of the storehouses. They go back to their father and they say, "Oh, father, we've lost a second brother." This leads Yaqub to say, "No, your souls have prompted you to do wrong, but it is best to be patient. May God bring all of them back to me. He alone has the knowledge to decide." And he turned away from them, saying, "Alas for Joseph. His eyes went white with grief, and he was filled with sorrow. They said, by God, you will ruin your health or even die if you do not stop thinking of Joseph or even die. He said, I plead my grief and sorrow before God. I have knowledge from God that you do not have. My sons, go and seek news of Joseph and his brother, and do not despair of God's mercy. Only disbelievers despair of the mercy of God." So in this powerful section here, we see a couple of things. First, that when they come back to Yaqub and they say to him, "Oh, Dad, we've lost a second son," he becomes upset because this is triggering for him. It reminds him of his son Yusuf, who's also been lost when he was in the company of his brothers. So he says, "Fasabrun jamil." So he will do a beautiful patience. And this is something that is known for Yaqub, that he's someone who is very patient, that he's not someone who is rash, that he lives his whole life without Yusuf, but then is reunited at the end. And then he makes this remarkable statement, "Asallahu ayatiyani bihim jamia," that he says, it may be possible that God will bring to me all of them together. And there's a couple of fascinating things in this phrase, that he uses this terminology of asa, or perhaps. And this in Arabic has a connotation of maybe or most likely will occur. So he's saying most likely God will allow that all of my sons come back to me. And here it's interesting that he could have said bihima, or in the dual tense in Arabic. So Arabic has this tense where you can say two. And he could have said, "Oh, may God bring those two back to me." But he says bihim, meaning all of them. And maybe this is referencing that all of his sons will be reunited at the end. And he says the God is the most knowledgeable and the most wise. And then he turns away from them. And then he says that, oh, alas, my Yusuf. So he can see here that he has this really a remarkable emotional connection with his son, that even though he's lost and long gone, he still has this hope that he'll be reunited with him. وَبِيَضْ عَيْنَاهُ مِنَ الْحُزْنِ. And then it says here that his eyes became white. And there's a different commentaries and interpretations, and some say that he became blind or his eyesight became diminished. But here it says literally in the literal sense that his eyes became white out of sadness and he was in a state of grief. And this is really one of the things that modern Quranic scholarship is focusing on, is the idea of emotions in the Qur'an. And oftentimes we read these figures and we talk about different stories and plots, but we overlook the emotions that these characters have and their humanity. And here he talks about his idea of sadness, that he was in the state of grief, that he was in a moment of loss and mourning. And then the brothers, they come back and they speak to him and they say, oh, we swear by God that if you keep remembering Yusuf like this, that you will eventually die. You become among those who are destroyed. You can see that the sons care about their dad. They care about his health and well-being. And they're worried that this sense of loss, of being separated from Yusuf, will eventually lead to his demise. And then he makes this remarkable statement. And he says that, إِنَّمَا أَشْكُو بَثِّي وَحُزْنِي إِلَى اللَّهِ. So he says that, yes, I am sad, but I complain of my anguish and my sorrow to God. And I know from God what you do not know. وَأَعْلَمُ مِنَ اللَّهِ مَا لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. So here he's emphasizing the point that he's a prophet, that God has given him certain information, certain knowledge that others have not. Now, it's unclear if he knows that he will be reunited with his sons, but maybe he has most likely an inclination. He has a feeling. He has intuition that even though Yusuf has been long gone and not part of his life for years, eventually he'll be reunited back with him. And here we see the emphasis of complaining. So in the English language, when we use the word complain, we think of it as a negative quality, that someone is complaining, that they're talking about their issues and they're being unproductive and they're not being optimistic. But here it's actually used in a positive light, that he is complaining about his anguish and his sadness to God. And the idea here is that complaining is actually a sign of intimacy. If you see a married couple or two friends and they go out and they're speaking to one another, a lot of it is about complaints. They're complaining about their life, about their studies, about their work. And you would only complain to someone that you feel close to. And here, in the sense that he is complaining to God, that he's not complaining to his sons who are not empathetic, they're worried more about his health rather than his feelings. But he's saying, I'm going to go to God and I'm going to speak about what is really bothering me and troubling me. And then he says this statement to his sons, and he says, Ya bunay idhabu fatahassasu min al-Yusuf. So he says to his sons, go and search diligently for Yusuf and his brother. وَلَا تَيْأَسُوا مِنْ رَوْحِ اللَّهِ. And do not despair or lose hope in the mercy of God. إِنَّهُ لَا يَيْأَسُ مِنْ رَوْحِ اللَّهِ إِلَّا الْقَوْمُ الْكَافِرُونَ. And he says, for one loses hope in God's mercy, those who are only have no faith. So here you see that he now takes the role of a father. Right? So you see that he's talking about his sadness, he's talking about his hopes and his dreams, and then the sons, they start saying, Dad, we're worried about your health and your well-being. But now he puts on his father and even prophetic hat, and he says to them, now go look for your brothers who have been lost, and do not despair or do not lose hope in the mercy of God. Right? So you can see now he's giving spiritual guidance to his children. And he says to them, those who lose hope in God's mercy are those people who do not have faith. And this is, I think, an essential point, because oftentimes we talk about the idea of belief. What is belief, right? And what is iman or faith in the Islamic tradition? Is it simply believing in God or the Prophet Muhammad is the messenger? But here we get to a more foundational definition, that faith is connected to the mercy of God, and that faith is equivalent to hope. That if someone has hope, then they have faith, that they have the sense that God will give them better than they have today. So a mu'min or a believer is not someone who just believes in God, but they believe in the mercy of God and God's potential to give them goodness in their life. And someone who has no faith or is a kafir is someone who doesn't have faith in their heart and doesn't believe in God and subsequently his mercy and his divine will. So in conclusion, we see that a couple of themes emerge when we talk about the biblical and Qur'anic Jacob or Yaqub. So first, that Yaqub is someone who is very emotional. So when you think of dads, oftentimes what comes to my mind are dads are very stern and very straightforward and they discipline. But we see with Yaqub that he is someone who is very in touch with his emotions, that he cries, he is sad, he talks about the idea of grief. And he says to his children that he's going to complain to God and he's going to complain about his sadness and his anguish. So one amazing aspect here within the story of Yaqub is this idea of loss and this idea of feeling the emotions connected to that loss and that anguish. The second thing we see here is his patience, فَصَبْرٌ جَمِيلٌ. And he's known in the Qur'anic and even biblical tradition, someone who is patient. He realizes that his son has been taken away from him, that he's been separated from him. And this causes him immense sadness and grief. But he says that I'm going to be patient, and not just only patient, but I'm going to have a beautiful patience, because he realized that even though he's been separated from his son, Yusuf and Benjamin, eventually he hopes, because of his belief, that he's going to be reunited with all of them. And then lastly, we see this definition of faith, right? What is faith in the Islamic tradition? And faith is connected to the idea of hope. That if someone who falls in despair and depression eventually cannot see the positive, they can't see the goodness. And if they can't see the goodness, then the question is, why should I live, right? What's the point of tomorrow? So here he makes a spiritual statement to his sons that don't despair in the mercy of God. Those who despair in the mercy of God are those people who do not have faith. If we understand things in their opposites, we see that the believer is the one that has faith in the mercy of God. In other words, they have hope. They have hope that things will become better because there is God, and God is all-encompassing and merciful. So thanks once again for listening to the Islamic Mary podcast. I would encourage you to order my book, The Islamic Mary, which has been out for a couple of weeks now. Happy to see that there's been some reviews and some book reviews coming out shortly. You can also subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. We see that there's increased viewership and listenership on YouTube. So I'm going to hopefully make some playlists there that you can listen to. Encourage your friends, students, and colleagues to listen to this podcast. I'm actually teaching a course on interfaith and interreligious studies this semester, and I'll be using certain episodes throughout the course. We now have a library of over 80 episodes, and they include Quranic commentary, biblical and Quranic stories, as well as interviews. And you can go back and listen to those and share those with folks. You can review this podcast. Happy to see we have around 10 reviews already of this podcast, and happy to see that people are finding the information and discussion valuable. And you can visit my website and join my newsletter, where you'll learn more about my work, speaking, as well as my book tour on the Islamic Mary. Thanks once again, and take care.